Okay. Nice to meet you. I think we should get started here. I would like to welcome everybody again to this next plenary session of the 26th Annual Faculty Conference. This is kind of the year of the newbies, because not only do we have with us a new president of the Federalist Society, although he had to go off to a meeting with a donor, which is also important, but we also have a new president-elect of AALS joining us to say a few words. Now a new president of AALS is fairly normal, president-elect actually, that's fairly normal, that turns over every year. But in addition, we also have the new executive director and CEO of AALS, and both of them are here to say a few words to us. So let me, without further ado, introduce Austen Parrish, who is, as I said, the president-elect of AALS. He is also the third dean and of UC Irvine and the chancellor's professor of law there. He's had a distinguished career, both as a scholar and as an academic administrator. His research as a scholar focuses on international law, transnational litigation, and the role that national courts and other domestic institutions play in solving global challenges. His career in academic administration includes an 8-year stint as dean at Indiana Mora, which is the one in Bloomington, where he received IU's Bicentennial Medal and also the Provost Medal, which are pretty big medals for academic administration. And he also served stints as interim dean and vice dean at Southwestern. Most importantly, perhaps, however, he is not Ashley Parrish, as our new Federalist Society president, Sheldon Gilbert, found out somewhat to his chagrin when he greeted him as a long-lost friend at a reception here on Tuesday. It turns out that Austen and Ashley are identical twin brothers, with both exceptionally distinguished legal careers. Ashley is the head of the appellate practice at King and Spalding, and they even wear the same glasses. So we are delighted to welcome here Austen, not Ashley Parrish, to say a few words of welcome. Kellye Testy comes to AALS from the Law School Admissions Council, where she served as president and chief executive officer for 7 years. Before that, she was dean of the University of Washington School of Law and previously of Seattle University School of Law. She previously visited this conference some years ago, I think back in 2016, when she was president-elect of AALS, and she played an important role in institutionalizing the relationship between AALS and the Federalist Society. So we're thrilled to welcome her back in her new capacity, and her new and important capacity as the Chief Executive Officer of AALS. So we'll hear first from Austen and then from Kellye.
Well, Lee, thank you for that kind introduction. Just a small correction, my glasses are much more distinguished than my twin brothers. It's a privilege to be able to welcome you to the 26th. I know somewhat late in the process, but the 26th annual faculty conference. I believe this is the 10th year that it's been held here at the AALS annual meeting in collaboration to one another, and I think that's fabulous. I will start my service, hopefully, if everything goes well, this Saturday as the new president, and my presidency will last through the year. And I'm pleased, on behalf of the executive committee of the association, to be able to congratulate you on what looks like an absolutely fabulous conference. It's good to see some friends on the panel and in the audience, and I've actually read a couple of the papers from and they look terrific. This is an important year for the association. It was founded in August of 1900 when 35 members of law schools joined together in Saratoga Springs to create the association. And so this coming year we'll be celebrating our 125th year anniversary. And it's interesting when you look back at those historical documents from 1900, and I was complaining about my travel up here from Los Angeles and a couple of flights, and then look back at the people in 1900 that had something like an 18-hour train ride to get to Saratoga Springs. It's amazing how much the association has grown. We now have more than each year 108 sections, 1,000 volunteers, more than 9,000 law faculty from 176 members and another 18 member schools. And each year, particularly this section, we have more than 1,000 speakers at the conference and more than 200 sessions and panels. It's really a great coming together of the best, I think, of legal education and the academy to come and talk about the key issues of the day. And AALS seeks to be that vital resource for faculty and staff from the start of their careers all the way throughout their career at the different stages, and also to be a resource for law schools and legal education, and not only advancing law, but advancing our reputation broadly. So I hope you guys will not only be able to get a great couple of days here in this conference, but also take advantage of some of the other sessions. And if you're having trouble sleeping, you should come to my Saturday address, which will be fabulous. The relationship between the association and the Federalist Society has always been important. I think one of the reasons why it's important is that AALS hopes to bring together the broadest range of voices throughout legal education to talk about the most pressing issues of the day. I certainly know Lee and Sheldon and others are committed that part of what makes Federalist Society good is having these deep conversations with people with lots of different perspectives and different backgrounds. And I think the mark of this conference over the last 26 years has been some really interesting perspectives. So we're very pleased to continue to partner with you. And certainly this year it seems the same, that it's great to see you doing so many workshop panels to hear some great new scholars, but also some established scholars. So this coming year, as we celebrate the 125th year anniversary, we'll be focusing on the impact that legal education has had on the world and on our communities. And I hope in your next conference you consider whether you might also do a bit of a retrospective and look back at some of the impact that you've had over the last 26 years of this conference to complement the broader themes of looking back at our history and the impact that legal education has had on the United States and abroad. So one of the things I think is great about this conference, and certainly about your next panel, I think, is that there's lots of disagreement or differing views. The one thing that nobody has ever disagreed with is a shorter dean's speech is a good one. And so I will now turn it over to Kellye Testy, again from behalf of the Executive Committee of the Association. Welcome, and thank you so much for a few minutes to welcome you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to be with you. And Lee, thank you for the kind introduction, and really appreciate you welcoming me and Austen, not Ashley, into the conference. We had a wonderful dinner. We have a tradition on the first evening of having a president's dinner for AALS, and I was so pleased that Lee was able to join us, and so was Sheldon, and it was really wonderful to meet him and to welcome him. I want to just make sure you know that at AALS you're very welcome here. We love working with you every year so that this works out in terms of coming here and enjoying the conference within the conference, so to speak. I am very pleased to be working now as the CEO and Executive Director of AALS. It's fun for me, having been the president a few years ago, to get re-immersed in AALS and back closer, in a closer tie to the Legal Academy again. at the Law School Admission Council, I was kind of a chief cheerleader out there for all the candidates, trying to encourage people to apply to law school. But it's wonderful to be back with all of the faculty and hearing the ideas and understanding the different viewpoints. And that's something that I have always treasured. There's no problem, I know, that isn't better analyzed from multiple perspectives and a diversity of perspectives. And so I really welcome that, and I look forward to AALS continuing to be the big tent where ideas from all perspectives are welcome, and that we really encourage that plurality of viewpoint within the programs and sections and all that we have. So, like Austen noted, I hope you'll not only enjoy this event when you're here, but that you'll be active participants within our many sections and many programs. And I stand ready if there's any way that I can assist anyone and work together to make that happen. You need only be in touch. So thank you so much again for having me here, and I want to not stand in the way of this panel. It looks like a terrific one. So have a great rest of the conference, and please do join us at the other events that the association is hosting, including a reception this evening downstairs in the exhibit hall that takes place, I think, right around 5 to 6 or so tonight. Thank you, and enjoy.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you coming here. My name is Stephen Sachs. I am honored to moderate this panel on institutional neutrality in academia and beyond. This is an increasingly pressing issue, as I am sure all of you know. Universities have taken a variety of approaches, shall we say, to institutional neutrality over the last decade or so. There were periods when universities spoke out in their corporate capacities only rarely. There were periods when they seemed to be speaking out quite frequently. And more recently, they have started to backtrack, with a number of institutions newly adopting policies on institutional neutrality, especially in the wake of October 7th. And the panel today will explore a variety of issues regarding institutional neutrality and the various dilemmas and opportunities that it presents. I'm honored to have with us today Robert George, the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton, Andrew Crespo, my colleague, the Morris Wasserstein Public Interest Professor of Law at Harvard, Evelyn Douek, Assistant Professor of Law at Stanford, and Robert Post, Sterling Professor of Law at Yale. We will hear from each of them for about 6 minutes or so. Then we will have another round where we hear from them for 4 or so for shorter comments, and then we'll have some crosstalk and open it up for questions. So without further ado, Professor George.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a real honor to be participating in this panel and to be here with old friends and new friends. My job is to make the traditional case, as it was styled to me, for institutional neutrality. And I'm happy to do that because I happen to believe in institutional neutrality as the correct policy for non-sectarian colleges and universities and units within universities, including not only arts and sciences departments, but also professional schools. And the premise of my belief and of any argument that I would make is that the fundamental purpose, the mission of colleges and universities is the pursuit of truth. That's as true for law schools and modern medical schools and even business schools as it is for arts and sciences departments. And if universities and their internal units are to pursue truth, certain conditions have to be in play. Some of those conditions will apply even at sectarian, religiously affiliated colleges and universities. And if anybody would like to talk about those institutions, I'll be happy to do so later. But my focus this morning is on non-sectarian institutions, like the ones that those of us up here on the panel are affiliated with. I believe institutional neutrality is one of the conditions that's got to be in place for non-sectarian institutions to pursue truth in the way that is best suited to them. I also think freedom of speech, the same premise of my argument for freedom of speech. My so-called free speech fundamentalism, my conservative and my liberal friends now gang up on me and call me a free speech fundamentalist. My free speech fundamentalism flows from that same principle that the whole purpose of our enterprise, our vocation as scholars, the mission of our institutions is getting at the truth of things. Now, I'll get to the question of why institutional neutrality is an important condition in institutions like those represented up here on the panel for truth-seeking. But first, I want to clear away some potential misunderstandings by saying what I think colleges and universities and professional schools should not be neutral about and cannot be neutral about. They shouldn't and can't be neutral about whether the pursuit of truth is their mission. They can't, and certainly shouldn't be, neutral about respecting freedom of speech. There are a lot of things that are important to the mission and the prosecution of the truth-seeking mission of the university that universities can't be neutral about. What then should, in my view, they be neutral about? Well, here we'll go to the locus classicus of institutional neutrality, the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, report issued by the committee chaired by the great law professor Harry Calvin in the 1960s, I believe it was 1967, in which it was articulated that the role of the university is to sponsor and host the critic or the critics, and not to be the critics. Individual faculty members, individual students, guests who come onto the campus to lecture or engage with students and faculty in seminar and other discussions, they are the critics. They should be able to advance any view about any topic, no matter how controversial their view is, no matter how badly mistaken from the objective point of view it is. They should be able to advance and defend any point of view. But the university should not take a perspective, should not take a view, hold a view on who's right and who's wrong. The idea is that the truth can best be pursued in institutions like these by the clash of ideas, where orthodoxies can be challenged, where dominant points of view can be subjected to critical scrutiny, even if only by a minority of one, so that bad ideas can be exposed as bad ideas and good ideas can be shown to be defensible all the way down. And the way, again, universities, the sort represented here, do that is by hosting the discussion, hosting the critic, but keeping a thumb off the scales. In such a university, there will be dissenters from dominant points of view because there will always be dominant points of view. But there will not be heretics. There will not be the orthodox and the heretical. These institutions will not be churches, nor ministries of churches, nor will they be political parties or organs of political parties. If someone is considering majoring, a student is considering majoring in political science or philosophy or chemistry or women's studies or whatever it is, that student will not be a heretic because of that student's view on any particular issue, whether it's abortion, whether it is economic policy, whether it is the wars in the Middle East, no matter what it is, because there will be no departmental or university position on that matter. Under the institutional neutrality doctrine, the only time the university or a unit of the university should be speaking on a public issue is where the issue pertains directly to the functioning of the university as a truth-seeking institution. So if a state, whether it's Florida or Massachusetts, decides that there should be a law that you can't take the pro-Palestinian position or you can't take the pro-Israel position in the Middle East, there the university can and should speak out, because that's an issue on which the possibility of the university doing its job is jeopardized by the potential for litigation that would cramp or even shut down freedom of speech. So that's the basic case for institutional neutrality, and we can return to the nuances and counter-arguments and so forth as things unfold up here.
Thank you. Mr. Crespo.
Thank you all so much for having me. And, you know, I, about maybe 13 months ago, I think would have probably just co-signed everything that Professor George just said. So my starting point is actually very much in line with the starting impulse that universities should be the hosts of the conversation and not the participants in it. And I hope you'll forgive some sort of parochialism in these remarks. I'm going to just be speaking in a kind of grounded way from just watching this unfold at my own university over the past year or so, because that's really informed some of my thinking in a kind of concrete way. So I offer it a bit as almost a bit of maybe salient proto-case study for the conversation. So about maybe few days after the somewhat maybe infamous congressional hearing that then led quickly to the ousting of our president at Harvard, we had a conversation with our president came by to speak to our school, and I was the one who sort of raised my hand and said, just something to think about. Maybe we should adopt the Calvin principles. It seems like it would save us a whole bunch of trouble. And I think that my animating thoughts were both everything Professor George said. I actually thought that my biggest concern were what I would call essentially sort of virtue signaling emails that seemed to sort of come out in the immediate aftermath of events that seemed to be designed to just convey a kind of psychological, ideological affinity with a sort of, mass of the campus community. And I found them both problematic for the reasons Professor George says, and then also, just this was visceral at the time, politically awful for a university, because you could just get boxed into all sorts of things, and it was just, you're constantly going to be buffeted as a university. I thought we should just get out of the business of these sort of virtue signal emails. And I thought, look, Calvin principles seem like a really great way to do that. And as I said when I just started speaking, I actually still agree with a lot of the core case in favor of institutional neutrality. And yet, in watching this sort of unfold over the past year or so, have come to have a number of real just sort of concerns, and pragmatic ones mostly, with what this starts to look like in practice. So I'll just lay out three of them, and then hope that our conversation can just sort of pick it up from there. The first is that I actually think it's hard, if not impossible, I think I'll just go out and say impossible, for universities to be neutral on a large number of hot-button political questions. And that is because in addition to being the hosts of the conversation, most modern American universities are massive and massively complex corporate actors that move through the world and move through an increasingly contentious and challenging world. They are landlords, they are employers, they are investors, they are the literal home to thousands of people who live on their campuses. And as a result, policies and questions in the world impact them. In the same way that it's very hard to be a politically neutral corporation in the world, it's hard to be a politically neutral corporation that happens to be in the business of educating people. So I'll give an example of just something I heard on a panel about this topic, institutional neutrality. A colleague said, look, an obvious example of something we, the university, cannot be neutral on is immigration policy. 20% of our students are from overseas. We need them to be able to keep coming here. They are as much Harvard as anywhere else. So if there's policies that are changing visa requirements, we need to be able to take a position on that. In fact, you could take Professor George's sort of point about litigation. If we could litigate about it, we can speak about it. And I guess what I'm saying is there's quite a bit you could litigate about. In the same breath, this person said, so immigration policy, clear example of something that we don't need to be neutral on. It's part of our core function. And clear example of something that a university should be neutral about, because it's a hot-button, contested political question, abortion and reproductive justice. And I sort of thought, well, if 20% of our students are affected by visas, and we not only have relationships with a bunch of hospitals, but then also run a university health services center that employs doctors to provide medical care to our students, 50% or more of whom may come seeking reproductive care and abortions. It actually seemed like those were two examples that should be in the same category. Either both out, you can't speak about immigration policy or these other, or reproductive justice, or any number of, land use policies, tax policy. There's the range of things that I think are the core function of a university, or at least the essential functions. I think my first point of departure with Professor George is, I think that they actually are broader than just the truth-seeking function of higher education, simply because to run a big university, you have to do a lot in the world, and you have to be able to sort of take a stand on things that are controversial and then speak about them, which ties to just a related sort of concern within my first bucket of worries, which is I think there's a sort of, harmonic resonance between institutional neutrality and what I can at best describe as a kind of duck and cover approach to navigating choppy waters that I think many universities feel at the moment. And I can understand it. At times I feel attracted to it. Universities are going through one of the most challenging political climates they've had, certainly in my lifetime, certainly my professional lifetime. And there's a question then of whether to basically try to be quieter and more still and more evading the conflict, or leaning into it, including leaning into it, I would say, on the core mission. And I have a worry, and I don't think this it's not like it follows, X to Y, but that the arguments that tend to sort of go hand in hand with the broad view of institutional neutrality seem to often also come up in the same sort of register as ones that are, look, let's just try to be a quieter, smaller, stiller type of institution, which to me is challenging at a moment when I think higher education actually needs to be speaking much more. I think that precisely because some of the core missions of higher education are, in my view, under threat in our political climate, there's a challenge between trying to say, look, we need to be speaking a lot less and also speaking a lot more about our core missions and our core issues. Obviously, you can do both. As Professor George says, you can sort of say, look, we need to be quieter about some things and maybe louder about the core things. But it's a challenge to try to sort of pull those both off at once, and that gives me some worry. The second category of pragmatic things I've seen as a challenge is I'm just not very confident that the policies do the one thing that they promise to do. So we adopted our institutional neutrality, institutional voice policy at Harvard late summer. Since then, there have been at least, I think, 3 statements that are clearly covered by what the policy is supposed to get at. And I'll say this, all 3 are about, not just clearly within the scope of the policy, they're all about Israel and Palestine, which, as Steve says, is sort of, the moment, October 7th, that created this latest wave about trying to rethink when universities will speak. And one of the statements was the classic version, email to the whole campus with the Harvard seal saying, we condemn the thing that just happened off campus, but, that affects a number of our students. We condemn it. The other 2 were interviews by our president with the college paper, the Crimson, that went something like, well, in my personal capacity, I condemn the students who just said X or the thing that just happened. Now, I want to bracket the question of whether those things should be condemned, in part because the whole point of these institutional policies were to not have to answer whether they should be condemned, right? The fact that within months of having this policy, the gravity of going back to the condemnation meant that they immediately the policy was not a barrier, made me think, okay, well, it was a lot of effort to put something in place that doesn't seem to have actually the capacity to stop the thing we're trying to avoid. Felt like a paper tiger, or at least one that's easy to get through when you want to get through it. Now, that's maybe not so bad if the hope is to just say, look, the point of this is to just let the people who run the university have the judgment about when they're going to make these condemnatory statements or not. But the third bucket of concerns I have are that the policy as I've seen it, not just at Harvard, at other places, seems perhaps, while still permitting these types of runarounds at the top level, to be designed to apply much deeper into the org chart of a university than I would have expected given the impetus for these policies at the beginning. I imagined that the point for these policies was to basically stop what I'll call, big university, president, provost, deans, and just the school saying, we Harvard with the seal have this statement. That those seems to be the issues that were causing the most trouble. And I thought that was the point of the sort of effort to speak less, to avoid those sort of big university types of statements. As the policy has unfolded, both at Harvard and elsewhere, it applies to basically anyone who could be called a university leader. And you're a university leader, essentially, if you're a faculty member who seems to have basically any other title. So now the worry is not just, what the president says, but what the assistant director of undergraduate studies in, the music department might say, or the director of the center on, name your center, the director of whatever clinic. In other words, if you have a title that includes, assistant dean, director of, or anything like that, you're covered by this. And don't necessarily have as much freedom to just say, well, in my personal capacity or whatever, because presumably if you're at that point of the org chart, there are people above you who are concerned and observing whether or not you're complying with the policy. The challenge here, of course, is that the nature of university governance and administration is it is faculty members who hold these positions. Faculty members who have jobs both as researchers and as speakers and essentially as the core participants in the debate that Professor George is talking about, right? That the individual faculty member is supposed to be the one we're encouraging to take the controversial view, to never be labeled the heretic, to be the one who could mix it up. But I think as you look at how these universities are structured, a large chunk of our faculty hold these other titles and are then covered by what I'm worried is essentially a regime that has real chilling effects on speech. And I say this as someone who falls into that category. When we had a discussion at our school about whether to adopt this, the folks running the committee came and spoke to us, and they gave the presentation about academic freedom. And I raised my hand, and I just said, this all sounds great. I'm curious, how far deep into the org chart are you going to apply this? Because, I've taught here for 10 years, and I run a center called the Institute to End Mass Incarceration. And I just paused there, and, the title's not neutral. So what are you going to do with me? And I say that when speaking here at, AALS, because I think law schools in particular sit at the front line at this level. If you define the director of a clinic as someone who speaks for the university and thus has to potentially be quieter or steer clear of hot button questions, it's actually quite challenging to fulfill the pedagogic mission of a law school this far into clinical education as a major way that we teach. We teach by teaching people how to advocate, and we do it with live ammo. We teach them by doing it by being advocates in a blended practice pedagogical space. It's, again, very hard to press for neutrality while also teaching how to be advocates in an adversarial posture. And so I basically have a worry that it has pushed down to the point where it's quite easy for the big university to evade the policy, but maybe enforce it on the little university.
Thank you. Professor Douek.
Thanks. Thanks very much for having me. So I guess I want to start by highlighting something that is implicit in what has been said here, which is often how much agreement there is in debates around institutional neutrality. I think sort of the stylized version of the debates puts up these two polarized extreme positions that on the one hand, universities should make statements about all matters of politics, high and low, whenever their constituents, whether they be students, staff, or donors, call on them to do so or think that they should. Or on the other hand, that universities should never make any kind of institutional statement whatsoever. And of course, as with any stylized debate, a stylized version of a debate, once you push on it just for a second, I think it collapses. And indeed, I doubt whether either of these extremes fairly represents anyone's position in reality. Most of us live in the messy middle, which is where the difficult questions are, and it seems so far that everyone on this panel lives in that messy middle as well. I don't think anyone thinks universities as institutions should be making statements on all manner of things, to the extent that some have made statements on high-profile world events in the past. The Black Lives Matter protests or the invasion of Ukraine are examples that are often brought up in this context. I think we are seeing a mass movement away from that approach. That's what the 25 or so universities that have formally adopted such a policy in the last year seem to be suggesting, but I suspect we'll see it much more broadly than even those formal announcements, that that there's as Andrew put it, a duck and cover approach coming. But nor do any of these formal statements made by universities announcing these new positions of institutional neutrality suggest that universities will never issue statements. And indeed, essentially every single institutional neutrality statement that I have seen has a carve-out of some kind for what is commonly described as issues related to the mission of the university or directly affect the mission of the university or its core function. Some version of that, the Calvin report that Professor George mentioned and often pointed to as the Platonic ideal of a statement on institutional neutrality, suggests that statements will be necessary in instances in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry. Not possible, not you may make a statement, but necessary. It is important that the university stands up and makes statements in such context. Now, we are all lawyers here. I hardly need to spend time spelling out all the interpretive questions that these large, ambiguous terms raise, and Professor Crespo gave some great examples about immigration, abortion, how to think about those, and I'm sure that we as lawyers could all make compelling arguments on either side of that debate for those terms, whether we normatively agree that that's correct or not. So what I think is really difficult to do with these statements of institutional neutrality is exactly what their goal was, which was to try and take away the choice that administrators have to make. The discretion that administrators have to make, and I think that is indeed impossible because universities live in a political ecosystem and are inherently political institutions of a kind, and there is still room for much contestation about what institutional neutrality means and how it will play out in practice. And so then in thinking about that question, I think what needs to be kept in mind here, or the North Star, is that all of these statements of institutional neutrality don't see it as an end in itself, but as a means to a particular end, an end we might loosely describe as fostering academic freedom, the advancement of knowledge, or what Professor George called the pursuit of truth. And as Professor Post talks about in his writings on this, that's an empirical claim. What advances those goals in any particular case is going to depend on the particular facts. Sometimes, for sure, it might be institutional silence that advances the goal of academic freedom, so that academics don't feel chilled to take positions contrary to that of their institution. But I want to suggest there are some times where that's definitely not the case, and that university not making a statement might be more chilling than not, and what is important is not that the university is some sort of abstract idea of neutral, but that its institutional citizens, or of whatever kind, know that the university has their back and will support their speech. And that those situations, we can't ignore the political context. This does not exist in a vacuum. This is not a question that we can interrogate about topic by topic in any particular case. It's going to depend on our particular ecosystem and our particular political context. And in a moment where there are concerted attempts to undermine the idea of knowledge institutions and expertise, some of which may be warranted, much of which is surely political, a university staying silent may embolden these attacks and may indeed be chilling to those being attacked. So, as one example, we can talk about the congressional hearings that have already been mentioned on this panel, unsurprisingly, where presidents of universities were called before Congress to answer questions about anti-Semitism on campus. And when the president of Columbia appeared before Congress, she was questioned about the writings and statements of particular professors. Now, what President Shafiq did, I think, was worse than remain neutral. She denounced particular statements and announced that there were investigations either ongoing or going to take place, and said that one scholar will never teach at Columbia again. But had she not done that, had she remained neutral, I want to suggest that that also would not have particularly fostered academic freedom. I, as a junior scholar, far on the other side of the country, also felt chill watching that hearing. And I've just been given a note on time, which is also very chilling, which I didn't see get passed down before. But anyway,
This is a tutorial environment.
okay. So my point is simply this: to the extent that a university is acting just because of political pressure from certain constituencies or certain circumstances, institutional silence may be as unprincipled or problematic as institutional statements. That is not necessarily itself neutral. A duck and cover approach, if done for political reasons, is not a neutral choice. And so, this abstract notion of neutrality, again, we are a room full of professors. It should not surprise you when I make the claim that maybe there's no such thing as completely neutral, and that a conception of neutrality that focuses on whether a president's office has made certain press releases or not is a very thin one indeed.
Thank you, Professor Post.
Thank you, Steve, for the opportunity to be on this wonderful panel. And after this eloquence, what's left to say except to celebrate the messy middle a little bit more? So maybe we'll start with a spoonful of history. You may know that the Calvin Report, which Robbie mentioned, is written in 1967. George Beadle, who's president of Chicago, is facing demands by SDS, Students for Democratic Society, that they disinvest from South Africa. And he doesn't want to disinvest from South Africa. So he appoints a really stellar panel. Stiglitz is on it, and Harry Calvin is the chair. And the Calvin Report, issued in 1967, basically says, look, we're here, we have a mission, which is truth and education. Not merely truth, but truth and education. Those are our missions. And we shouldn't speak, we're a community for purposes of these missions, and we have to define what our missions are among ourselves, so we can't be neutral with respect to our missions. But outside of that, we really shouldn't talk because it will chill professors who might differ from what the university officially says. That's the basic theory of the Calvin Report. And it comes out in 1967. It sparks a great debate among American professors. There's a whole symposium set of issues at AAUP over it, but no other university adopts it besides Chicago. Of course, Beadle uses this as a response to SDS and says, if I disinvest in South Africa, I'm no longer neutral. The Calvin Report prevents me from doing it, so go away, don't bother me anymore. That's Chicago. Nothing happens. No university adopts this policy for more than 40 years. And then the Goldwater Institute issues a report on institutional neutrality in 2017. And they have a different spin on it than Calvin. The Goldwater Institute says, if the university violates institutional neutrality, by which they mean, and they say they mean, issuing a statement about matters of present controversy, it necessarily, inherently is the word that they use, will violate the academic freedom of faculty. And then this becomes a major political issue, it gets politicized, and the next university to act on this is University of North Carolina, 2022, when the trustees adopted the reasoning of the Goldwater Institute and said it's an inherent violation of academic freedom if the university takes a position on a matter of present controversy. They don't say, and it's outside the mission, they just say on a matter of present controversy, because what's in the mission, what's out the mission, this is quite controversial. So that's the background of the debate here. I should say I'm a former dean, and I would have very much liked to have Calvin Report. You know, every time there was an earthquake in, say, Tibet, I'd have to issue a statement saying, I feel for you, and it's something like that. And then, of course, when the earthquake is in southern India, then why aren't you issuing a statement? Is it that you care for those people? So if you're an administrator and you have to issue statements like this, you're in an impossible position. And you do want something to cover you to say, I can't, I'd love to, I love you, but I can't speak because we have the Calvin Report or whatever. So what we've discovered in Gaza, where there are people who are quite vocal on all sides of the issue, is universities are now saying, gosh, we can't be in the middle of this, we need a way out, Calvin Report is a way out. So that's the present status of the debate. I want to just say a few words about the logical status of this debate. The first point is, however you define it, a university cannot be neutral with respect to its mission, right? So it's one thing, for example, if you have affirmative action for social justice, that's outside your mission. It's another if you have it because it's necessary for education. That's inside your mission. You're going to have a great set of debates about what the mission is or not. And by hypothesis, you cannot be neutral about what your mission is because you have to be it. You have to do it. You have to define it. You're a subject of great debate. So whatever you say about institutional neutrality, a lot of the most controversial issues will be about the mission itself. And in that mission, of course, we as institutions make judgments all the time. There are lots of heretics in the university. If you're a mathematician and you want tenure and you say 2 + 2 is 5, you're a heretic. You do not get tenure for saying that. And now that's of course easy for math because everyone knows what math is and what's right or wrong. But suppose you're the dean of the public health and you say we need this vaccine. We need to vaccinate against polio or measles. And it's not going to cause autism or whatever it is. It's a public health thing. So the question of what the mission is a very complicated question when you come to different units within the university and who speaks for what within those units. It may not be the mission of Harvard to serve public health, but it sure as hell is the mission of the public health department. And it's going to be the mission of the social work department or the education department, you just name it. And in a law school, we have clinics, etc. So how this works out when you go to the mission, that's a complicated question. So let's bracket the question of how can you be neutral with respect to what you do every day, because you can't be. Now let's talk about the question of can you be prevented, because the appeal of the idea of institutional neutrality is it seems like a clear rule. If it's in the mission, you can talk about it. If it's outside the mission, you can't. So why is it that you can't? The Goldwater Institute argued that that was an inherent violation of academic freedom because it would chill people who disagreed with whatever the university says. To which a response is, well, you know, the Calvin report was about disinvestment in South Africa. About, I don't know, 200-300 universities disinvested in South Africa after 1967. And to my knowledge, there wasn't a single complaint that any professor felt chilled about it. That is to say, there are a lot of ways of saying things and doing things which can affect academic freedom, which can chill faculty speech, in which case it's bad not because it's not neutral, it's bad because it chills the academic freedom of faculty. A good example of that would be Nicholas Murray Butler. You might remember him, the eminent professor of Columbia during World War I, and we declared war, and he said any faculty member who opposes this war is fired. And he fired 2 or 3 faculty members who opposed the war. That's a statement that's non-neutral, that's meant to chill and successfully chilled faculty. Bad thing. Disinvesting in South Africa, which the Calvin Committee report considered to be a violation of institutional neutrality, I don't know how that chills anyone's academic freedom. There hasn't been any empirical evidence of that to my knowledge. So we have a spectrum. And the operative question in that spectrum is, does it or doesn't it chill? If it chills, it's a very bad thing. Because we want to preserve the freedom that Robbie was talking about. We want every faculty member to feel free to say what they believe to be true. That's what we are in a university. We are free to speak our minds and publish our research. That's what we do. Of course, we get judged for that. Some of you may not be tenured. You'll find yourself being judged for what you say. We judge the quality and competence of what we do. We don't judge it because it has political content. That's the meaning of academic freedom in a university, and we don't want that to be judgment. So we're in a messy situation in terms of institutional neutrality. And my own position that I have been arguing now for 30, 40 years is that academic freedom has 2 meanings. One is how we govern ourselves in a university. We want to be free to do our research and to publish. But academic freedom has a second meaning, which is the freedom of the university vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis the government. And lots of times we see statutes like the Florida DEI statute where the university should say to the state, you cannot tell me what to do. That's a different sense of academic freedom of the university as an entity vis-a-vis the state. And we can say that to the state because we produce goods that the state needs. We produce education and we produce truth. That's what we do. And if you want those goods, you have to give us the freedom to do those things. That's the argument of external academic freedom. And if we then start making statements that are irrelevant to our mission, we call this external notion of academic freedom, the claim against the state, into question. We undermine it. So we want to be very careful when we do that. Very careful. Because we don't want to undermine our ability to say to the state, don't tread on me. we need to be free to do what we want to do. So institutional constraint, restraint seems to me a really wise policy here. That's the policy, for example, of Princeton University. So I'm chilled, right? That's it. Gone. Done.
Thank you. So we're going to do another quick round of sort of 4-minute statements, but I want to introduce it by posing sort of 2 questions. So for one, many people have seemed to recognize on the panel that institutional neutrality is not some magical formula. It's more like, it's not some cut and dried rule, sort of henceforth we shall be neutral. It's more a regulative ideal. It's something that one would try to implement in various ways, in trade-offs with various other values. And how do we pursue that? And the second thing that I want to raise is the distinction between an institution's actions and sort of defense of those actions and its positions in general. So an example of this might be, like the examples that Professor Crespo noted, at my university, they serve meat in the cafeteria. That is more controversial, perhaps, than, or is less controversial than it ought to be. There is no official policy that I know of that states, per Harvard, meat eating is morally permissible. But they clearly think that it is, or else they wouldn't do it. And yet we can understand that if the dean came out tomorrow and said, by the way, everyone, I just want you to know meat eating is morally permissible, that would be seen as a sort of unusual kind of act that is distinct from the choice to serve meat in the cafeteria, even though that clearly sort of presupposes at least some level of permissibility. So how do we think about this disjunction between the positions that the university in its corporate capacity takes and the actions that it undertakes and might need some sort of underlying justification? But with that entree, we'll go down the list.
4 minutes. Okay.
Go.
Well, starting with Steve's last point, which I think is a very, very interesting one. As a defender of institutional neutrality, I have to admit, concede, allow that there are certain sorts of issues like serving meat in the cafeteria, whether our hospital, if it's a university that has a hospital, is going to perform abortions or sex trait modification surgeries or things like that, or whether our insurance policy for our students is going to cover abortions and so forth. There are certain immigration related decisions, Andrew, that the university is going to have to take. But I think Steve's onto something here when he says, it's one thing to take a position when you have no choice but to take a position, or you're acting. We're gonna have meat in the cafeteria, or we're not gonna have meat in the cafeteria. But it's another thing to take an official position about the morality of meat eating, if that's a subject that you really think should be debated robustly on the campus and on which there should really be no orthodoxy, no thumb on the scale. So that's something really worth talking about and thinking through, I think, better than any of us have so far. Now to Robert's excellent point, you've got to keep the focus in these debates on the mission, If we deviate from that into other considerations, I think we're going to go astray. And that will structure how we debate what is and isn't permissible when it comes to borderline questions, even within the principle of Calvin neutrality. If we keep focused on the mission, it's not going to mean that the answers will always be obvious. Is this inside or outside? May we issue a statement on this or may we not issue a statement on that? But it will enable us better to argue about it, and I think probably overall in the long run more often reach good decisions than we would otherwise. Then to a very good point that Andrew made, and this is really important to me. We must never allow institutional neutrality to become the enemy of freedom of speech or of academic freedom. And Andrew's right. If you restrict people from expressing their opinions publicly because they are director of the mass incarceration clinic or director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions or whatever it is, you're actually taking people in the university out of the debate. We don't want to do that. I think where there are legitimate institutional neutrality questions, again, within the framework of something like Calvin, about individual speaking. It's at the very top. And even there, I guess my free speech commitments, if push comes to shove, outweigh my institutional neutrality commitments. Even there, I don't want to prohibit the president of Harvard or Princeton from speaking. So long as they're not speaking for the university. Our president, Princeton, is a very distinguished constitutional scholar. There are issues of Christopher Eisgruber. There are issues of constitutional law in which he has strong opinions. Having his opinions out there is very valuable to the debate. I want him to be able to do that. But I'd like him to do it on his personal blog, not speaking for, purporting to speak, or in a way that could be confused by people or misunderstood by people as having him speak for the university. When he, just stay with the example of Chris Eisgruber, spoke out on the October 7 massacres, opposing the idea that what was done to those people at the Nova Festival was legitimate warfare of some sort. Even there, he spoke on his personal blog. And when I wrote him a note expressing my agreement with what he had said, he said, "I thought you would be pleased that I put it on my personal blog." And I wrote back and said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I was pleased that you put it on your personal," because although I agree with you, our university should not have a position in the debate that is raging on this campus right now about exactly how we should think about those issues. So I've probably exhausted my 4 minutes, but there are some things that I think deserve further debate and scrutiny.
Thank you. Professor Crespo.
So a hodgepodge of just 4 responsive thoughts to the whole conversation. 2 are about economics, 1 about heresy, and 1 about blogs. On economics, I agree that the action and speech distinction is useful conceptually, Steve. I think it's hard when many of these institutions are also major investment actors. I don't think it's an accident that Calvin is responsive to a divestment call, because it's very easy, just given the structure of sort of modern finance and investing, to say the university is acting on everything. Every hot button issue is in its portfolio. And so divest from X is an action claim. And it's just really hard to sort of tell the set of students as a university, well, no, this is our action zone and this is our just speech without action zone, when you're implicated in action through investment, and when that's the way to grow an endowment to be able to support all the things that we want to do. It's just an economic challenge that relates to it. A second economic challenge, I think Robert's point about, Professor Post's point about the challenge of empirics on whether a statement chills or not, is going to be tied to the trend in the economic structure of the profession more and more away from teaching through tenured professors. Because I actually think it is, my guess, again, it's an empirical guess, it's an empirical hypothesis, is that statements from a president that says, well, I think X is a bad idea, will be felt differently by someone who's on a 6-month contract, renewable every term, than someone who, like many of us, are either tenured or aspiring towards tenure and may get it. So the economic structure implicates the empirics based on just vulnerability. And even if you wouldn't lose your job, your perception of whether you might can do all the self-censoring and sort of chilling that we're familiar with in these debates. Okay, a quick on heresy. I just want to pick up on Professor Post's point about, the mathematician can't get tenure if they say 2 + 2 = 5. And to just draw from that one of the things that I think is conceptually most challenging about this debate, which is that there are, I think, this is maybe itself a controversial claim, recognizable heresies outside of mathematics that we just recognize. I was told a friend before walking over here that I would try to make it through this whole panel without talking about Habermas and the life world, and now I'm going to break that. But like,
if I had a nickel.
The basic idea here is, let me try one out. The United States ought not legalize slavery. Right? Like, there are certain statements that at this point in our country's development actually are just sort of within our broadly shared. Like, you could get people across the spectrum, but I think we could all name them as like, no, you're outside of the debate of sort of shared community people in the type of debate we're having. If you're just someone who says, look, enslaving people based on their race is great, we should do more of it, right? Now look, maybe the absolutists would actually say like, no, look, we want to sort of allow the broadest range. What I'm trying to say is culturally and sociologically, we can identify certain claims that actually are outside of our shared life world of things that we have consensus around that form what it means to be part of a shared community having a discussion together. I think universities should have very broad boundaries on that. I'm just saying conceptually, there is a boundary. Part of why this debate is so fraught is the fight is almost always about whether to put something inside that or not. Because when you're having a politically contentious debate, you not only want to win it, you want to win it and then declare it unrevisitable. You want to declare it as now my position is in the life world. And one way to do that within a campus setting is to get the university, the state essentially in your local community, to now adopt your position and declare it inside the life world, because now you've not just won, you've won forever. That's why the fight is always on the boundary. But it means that this question of heresy is a moving target. And then the last point, very small on the blog, I worry that it's just a loophole you can drive a truck through. You know, I worry that it's very similar to the interviews I mentioned that make me anxious. If the whole point of these statements was to get the president of the university to stop condemning student group for doing X, and now it just means you have to say, in my personal capacity, I condemn these students. You know, it's sort of, I don't know, for me it does less, I'm less comforted by the personal blog distinction just because it feels too easy to manipulate.
Thank you. Professor Douek.
Yeah, well, so I just agree with that last statement. I mean, I think that many of these are loopholes that you can drive your truck through, and that the speech conduct distinction in some sense is relevant, but again, in a room full of lawyers and a number of First Amendment lawyers know just how unstable that particular line can be. And I think it is important to talk again about how if we are just talking purely about the statements, maybe we would have a lot of agreement, but there are so many things subsidiary to that which are super important. I love the example of serving meat on campus, but there are so many others. Of course, the most controversial and prominent that gets talked about is the investment and divestment decisions. But there are many others. Scholarships, affiliations, university partnerships with foreign universities in certain regions, conditions on funding, what kind of financial aid to foreign students. While we're talking about foreign students, more than, I think, nearly 24 universities have released statements in the last few months urging their international students to get back on campus before Inauguration Day. Now, that's not a statement about a political issue, but it's a statement about a political issue, I think. You know, when you pick the date, January 20, you are clearly making a statement about politics. There was a story yesterday in Reuters about how several UK universities are shuttering their ex or former Twitter accounts and moving to other social media platforms, which also I think the insinuation was there was some political valence to this decision. And so I think it is turtles all the way down, and to the extent that these statements of institutional neutrality were intended to bind anyone's hands in any meaningful sense, I doubt they'll be effective.
Thank you. Professor Prost.
So I'm going to use Steve's question as an opportunity to introduce a distinction here between academic freedom and freedom of speech, because there's a tendency among us all to use these interchangeable. So just take the simple example we talked about before. You're a mathematician and your big tenure piece says 2 + 2 = 5, and you don't get tenure, right? Content-based judgment, viewpoint discrimination violates every rule of the First Amendment, and yet we do that all the time. That's the meaning of tenure decisions. So the way in which the speech is governed in a university is totally different than freedom of speech. In freedom of speech, we make no judgments. In universities, we constantly make judgments. We make judgments when we grade students. We make judgments when we give grants. We make judgments when we hire, et cetera, et cetera. What is the difference here? It goes to exactly what Steve was talking about in his question. It goes to the difference between a managerial system and a system of freedom of speech. In a system of management, we are gathered together and we organize our resources to attain an end. What Professor George talked about is the mission. So if you're in a bureaucracy, say you're in the Social Security Administration, you organize the speech of your employees to give out Social Security checks. And if your employees decide to stand on their desk and sing the Star-Spangled Banner, they get fired. Because even though they're talking, they have to talk in the right way. They have to say, you get a check, you don't, according to the rules, etc. We manage, within a managerial domain, we manage speech to attain the mission. A university is a managerial domain. We exist in order to have a mission. The mission is to educate, which is why when you go into class, if you're supposed to be teaching First Amendment and instead you're talking about the Super Bowl for 3 hours, there's going to be a problem with you and your dean. And that's appropriate because we have a mission and the speech is regulated in order to serve the mission. That's academic freedom. Academic freedom are the principles by which speech is regulated given the mission of research and finding truth and of educating. And there's a whole set of understandings of how those freedoms unfold. They unfold according to a completely different logic than freedom of speech. And then the issue that's been put on the table is what's the boundary if you happen to be an employee between your private speech as a citizen who wants to talk about Gaza and your speech as an employee who speaks for the university. This is a well-known First Amendment problem, which you see in the government employee speech cases. Some cases, like San Diego versus Roe, you might know it. If you're a policeman and you, on your private time, do pornography, you can be fired because of its reflection on the police department. In other cases, if you're a teacher in a school district and you write an editorial against a bond issue, the court will say it doesn't reflect because your interest in regulating the speech of the employee is no different than your interest in regulating the speech of any member of the public. These are judgment calls. It turns out most of law are judgment calls of this kind, and what we need to do is understand the principles at stake so we can correctly make the kind of judgments that Steve puts on the table with his question.
Thanks, all. We're going to have a few sort of questions to the panel and some crosstalk, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. First question I want to pose is trying to get a sense of the issue that's come a number of times, sort of faculty hiring. So there is a field where we at the same time recognize sort of a strong need for neutrality of certain sorts by the university. We think that there's a reason why, for instance, non-religious institutions do not, as the first question in the, at the job talk, ask, well, what do you think about the Filioque clause? But we do, on a hiring committee, try and make assessments of, well, how good is this person? Is their work useful? Is it productive? Is it in a field that is going to be generative of useful stuff? And what I am wondering about from the panel is recognizing that these are not sort of easily defined distinctions. How do we articulate what is the attitude that members of a hiring committee or people voting on a tenure decision should take with respect to neutrality? And anyone who wants to answer can do so.
I used to have, do you all know Judy Butler, who's a famous kind of feminist postmodernist theorist? I used to have a dog and pony show with her where we would go to different venues, and she's being very postmodern, would always say everything always has to be open. And I'm saying, yeah, but how are you going to vote? You have to make a decision. And as you make a decision, so you define what competence is for you when you hire someone. And that's a debate we have. And the interesting thing about debates is they unify us because we're debating the same thing, and we talk to each other, and hopefully between us, we construct some common denominator about what should and shouldn't count as competence among ourselves as a faculty.
Well, for reasons I articulated earlier, I really worry about orthodoxies and heresies, because I think having those things really does undermine the truth-seeking and educational mission, the truth transmission mission of the university. I don't want it to be the case that when I am asked to vote on hiring a new assistant professor in politics or philosophy or whatever at Princeton, or when I'm asked to vote on a candidate that is up for tenure, I don't want it to be the case that I have an institutional incentive to wonder whether that person is a Democrat, a Republican, a liberal, a conservative, a socialist, a libertarian, or what have you. But if my department is permitted, and in some departments it seems to be not just permitted but expected, to take public stands on issues that break along those ideological lines, then am I not being asked to make political judgments about whether I want that person to be voting down the line on what our department's stance is going to be? That looks to me like the road to hell, the thorough politicization of the university. Now, we obviously have to make judgments of competence. You know, Andrew, if I had a distinguished mathematician at Princeton, someone who'd made it through all the hoops to get to the top of what my math colleagues at Princeton tell me is the greatest math department in the world. And one of them said, you know what, 2 + 2 = 5. I'd wonder, maybe this guy's got something interesting going on. Or maybe he just lost his mind, or maybe he's playing me, or having fun, or what have you. But we do have to make judgments of competency. But then when we get beyond those into issues, even an issue like slavery, I would not want an orthodoxy. Even today, I wouldn't want an orthodoxy. I wouldn't want that heresy to be the grounds for excluding someone. I have colleagues, and you, I'm sure, in your philosophy department and elsewhere at Harvard, have colleagues who are moral subjectivists, moral skeptics, moral relativists. They argue that there's no such thing as right and wrong. Slavery's not wrong, it's not right, it's not wrong. There's nothing that's right or wrong, that all so-called moral judgments are projections of emotion or what have you. That's not my view. I hold the opposite of that view, sort of Aristotelian metaethical realist, but I think they have an important place on it. I want them to be there to make that argument. I have utilitarian colleagues. I have a colleague who famously defends infanticide, not just in the hard cases, but just as in any case anyone wants to get rid of a baby up to, at one point he said 28 days after birth, even a perfectly healthy baby. I support that guy's being on my faculty, even though I would not want his views to be enacted into law. And I wouldn't want our university condemning his views while leaving him on the faculty. I want to be able to debate him, even Stephen, no university thumb on the scales in the debate between us. Let our students, let our colleagues hear what he's got to say on his side of the issue, what I've got to say on my side of the issue, and then let the chips fall where they may.
Would you vote for him if he were like an untenured person with that thesis, and if so, why?
I believe I did. Yeah.
And why?
Because I think he's making a contribution
Why?
to the debate.
Why?
Because,
I could
because he's made arguments that challenge me and make me think.
He makes good arguments.
Yeah, I don't think they're successful arguments. If I thought there were successful arguments, I'd change views and have his view. But it's when I'm grading a paper, for example. You know how to get an A from me? It's not to agree with me. It's to make me think. It's to challenge. You can argue something that's absolutely antithetical to everything I'm well known to believe. But if you make me think, if I think, gosh, this, and I think we need more of this in the academy. I think this is the fundamental, I think this is the reason we don't have viewpoint diversity. And nobody here is going to kid themselves and say we've got viewpoint diversity in contemporary academia. I mean, clearly we don't. All right, so why don't we? It's because I think the most fundamental, number of reasons, multivariate, but I think the fundamental reason is it's so hard. We human beings, we original sinners, we frail, fallible creatures, find it really hard to distinguish, on the one hand, work that I really disagree with and think is really wrong from, on the other hand, work that I think is wrong, but it's really interesting and challenging, and it's making me think, and, gosh, maybe there's something to this, and maybe I'm the one that's wrong. That's how knowledge is properly pursued. That's how we move the ball forward.
So really important point here, the distinction between a good argument and a successful argument, right? And there's some areas of knowledge where that distinction does not hold. It turns out in law, it's a big debate, but my own position would be we very much turn on the distinction between good and successful arguments. Otherwise, we couldn't have law as a debate which includes people with different views. Hard to do that in math.
Well, I would say in some ways it might be easy in math because you can just do the contrapositive. I mean, I think that's the greatest thing you could have for a philosophy professor who produces sort of unacceptable conclusions. It's like, it's a great demonstration of why the premises must be false. So just put a not sign in front of the whole thing, and then it's gold.
The philosophy department in Davis wanted to be moved to the division of natural sciences for that reason.
Yeah. So, Robert, when I've made this argument in front of science colleagues, it's amazing how many times people from the sciences have said to me, "You are overestimating the measure of agreement in the sciences, or even the measure of agreed terms on which we judge right and wrong in the science." I'm not sure about math, but certainly I've heard that from people in physics, chemistry, biology.
Steve, the appointments question for me teases out actually a maybe interesting point about the speech action thing that you put on the table. Because one of the unique things about appointment actions, I think we'd all say the appointment is an action, right? Is it's one of the ones that is, through the norms, supposed to be one you don't have to justify broadly. You have to justify it internally within the faculty, but that's like the behind the curtain conversation. And you don't then usually come out and say, and we denied tenure to that person for these reasons, or we hired that person for these reasons, unless it comes out in discovery in some sort of, right? Which is different from your meat example. I think actually one of the challenges, and this is my fear about the duck and cover, is especially in a reason-giving profession of universities and law schools in particular, if the dean gets a question at 1L section night, why do you have meat in the cafeteria? This is terrible, it's a moral atrocity. Presumably, he would be a bad embodiment of a lawyer and a law professor to tell them, I'm not going to engage with this in any reasoned way. I have silence as my response to you. He'd feel an urge to give a reason, but the whole point then is he'd be moving into speech, and that's a challenge from the institutional neutrality bit, which for me is where then the chill on duck and cover comes from, because the flip is he worries, okay, I should just avoid all places where I might be called into, have to account for my actions, or I might have to try to take actions differently because of the fact that I might later be called to give reasons for them. And I just, that's for me the worry that the speech action thing has slippage to it, and maybe is not as avoidable as, or not as clean of a way out of the dilemma.
Though it may be that there are institutional reasons that a dean in that position would cite that would be inapplicable on a sort of individual level. So you'd say in some sense, look, I know that lots of people disagree about meat in the cafeteria, but lots of people eat it, and sort of as a sort of in our pastoral role, this is something that the institution has decided is the right way to proceed, although we take no sort of official position on the merits. There's a way of giving that speech, which we can imagine our deans all doing in that context. And in some ways, that would sort of be the divestment speech too. That sort of there's an agreed upon rationale of maximizing risk-adjusted returns, and then there are lots of other rationales that are sort of competing, and that an institution may be more or less willing to take on its own.
I would classify that as what maybe Robert was calling an academic freedom-protecting enunciation of a non-neutral position. In other words, I don't think that would be a neutral statement. That would just be a way of explaining why this particular non-neutral view on this controversial issue is one that we've taken, and that I'm going to explain it in a way that tries to create as much space for now a bunch of dispute about it.
Another way to say that is, what you're saying, Steve, is that every action requires a reason, right? And then the question is the reason consistent or inconsistent with the mission of the university?
Yes, very good.
End of story.
So I want to ask another question of the panel about the org chart question, which is, what do you think is the right level of org chart for these principles to apply at, if any?
Higher than me.
And I want to add with this, and I hope I'm not abusing the privilege of the moderator, that I think that the position of law school clinics is fascinating. Because here we have an official arm of the school that takes explicit positions on lots of things, that, tenant A should win in their lawsuit against landlord B, that various acts of legislation should be adopted. There are lots of legislative clinics that write sort of policy papers that advance positions. And so trying to figure out, like, what is it about an arm of the university that either makes it or does not make it appropriate for this purpose. I will say, just, as a thinking back to my undergrad days, I would have been much more worried about a blog post, frankly, from the assistant director of undergraduate studies in the history department than I would have from, President Rudenstein. That person actually affects me in my thesis, whereas, I'm never going to meet Rudenstein. So it's a real question, what is the right role institutionally for these principles to operate?
What would you say about medical clinics? I mean, the doctor says take Paxlovid, not ivermectin.
I think the thing is that everybody thinks that, livers are good. And we're all agreed that the patient should live, most of the time, but we are not necessarily all agreed that the tenant should win.
But we disagree about what the appropriate remedy is, right? I mean, it's a political issue what the remedy is for COVID, right? But the physician is taking a position.
Yes.
Well, let me just, maybe I'm not understanding. Within the medical school, I'm assuming it's not a political issue, it's...
About the clinic. You have a clinic where
Oh.
your students are giving advice, or your faculty's giving advice to a patient, comes in from the...
Right, but isn't it a...
I guess what I meant to say is, in those circumstances, it is in some sense the position of the school that X is a permissible remedy for Y. So the school, as a med school, it teaches, the leg bone really is connected to the knee bone, and this really, you should take 2 pills of this kind and call me in the morning. Like, those are things that it actually teaches. I don't think the law school teaches all of the position, as sort of the correct thing, all the positions that its clinics take. That's what the sort of distancing I find very interesting.
So what do you do in a moot court when you teach a moot court?
What do you guys think?
Well, I'm lost on the question. I wanted to get back to Robert, and just so I'm understanding correctly. It's one thing to have a position as an institution, say as a clinic or a hospital, on whether a particular putative medication is effective or not. That seems to be different to me than having a position on a contested moral or political matter, so that you're making a judgment of a person based on that person's moral or religious beliefs.
That's why I gave the example of a moot court. So in law schools, we teach a moot court, and we say, you have to defend this person who you find horrible, and you have to attack this person who you love. I mean, we generally try to mix up the politics from the...
That's right. And
we teach them not whether the position is correct. We teach them how to take a position, how to argue it in law, how to translate a legal position into an effective argument. That's what we're teaching.
that's right.
The same is true in the clinics.
And so in the moot court, if I understand it correctly, certainly I do them in my constitutional interpretation class. I assume law school is the same way. Everybody understands that when a student is being asked to take a position, he's like an actor in a play. It's not necessarily a position. He's assigned that position. So we don't have a compelled speech issue. Although at the margins, I can imagine a student with, say, very, very powerful conscientious objections. You would say, okay, well, look, if you just can't in conscience stand up, even play acting.
Just say I'm surprised at the level of acceptance that there is such a thing as like apolitical medical truth, where we were politicizing 2 + 2 = 5, but the idea that a doctor's advice exists as a matter of medical expertise without politics, when we've just gone through a pandemic where the very idea of whether you should get a vaccination or whether ivermectin or bleach is an effective cure for COVID-19 was whether you believed those claims as true or false became a highly politicized issue.
I think that's very unfortunate.
Of course.
What we should, I hope what medical people, including medical educators, do is try to figure out whether a medication is effective for its purpose or not, and not make a prescription based on a political view. I mean, I don't think it's naive to say doctors shouldn't do that. They shouldn't allow politics to influence their care of their patient.
Correct. I mean, the point is, it's a classic liberal position, separation of powers, the sphere of politics, the sphere of knowledge. And when these two get combined, says Claude Lefort, the French political theorist, that's when you have a dictatorship or tyranny. When Stalin gets to say, there's no genetics because everything is environmental, because Marx tells us that everything is right. So when you combine the sphere of knowledge and the sphere of power, you have a problem. We exist in the sphere of knowledge. And so when we make these judgments, which we do all the time, and they're judgment calls, and they're influenced in all the ways that judgments are influenced, they're supposed to be within the sphere of knowledge. We're supposed to rationalize them and justify them the way we would justify any knowledge claim. In the clinic question, which you're raising, it's not a knowledge claim, it's an education claim. The way in we have clinics to educate our students in how to be lawyers. And so we're not educating them in the truth of the claim that they make, we're educating them in zealous advocacy, which is part of the lawyer's role.
And I think what really raises the distinction, perhaps, is that when we have amicus clinics or sort of legislative clinics, to what extent are the students play acting for a client? And to what extent is this supposed to be the authentic expression of the students' views? And when
I was a lawyer, I was always confused about that.
Let me ask a question to my law professor colleagues. Is it the case that at your law schools or at law schools generally, when it comes to the clinics, Andrew, that the law schools allow there to be clinics, as it were, on both sides of controversial questions? So there could be a clinic that operated on a pro-life view and a clinic that operated on a pro-choice view, and both would be allowed under the institution's basic commitment to some sort of neutrality on that issue. Is that correct?
I think I missed the last bit, but I think that the general idea that within the ecosystem, one ought to not only tolerate, but I think the idea would be invite a kind of plethora of different perspectives and sort of, ideological valences, for lack of a better word, on these things.
There is a bias, though, because you can't have a clinic for a client who can pay.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Okay, yeah.
And also, it's based on what faculty members in the institution want to support. So I know of very few death penalty enforcement clinics that, argue in favor of the state's position.
But that's because to enforce the death penalty, you have to be the state.
Well, but the state, it's a public entity. It's a charitable purpose to support what the what the people are trying to do, and so. But you don't tend to see that, where you do see clinics sort of hand in hand with public actors in other environments.
So could a religious liberty clinic? I know there's one at Yale. Right?
Many.
The kind of religious liberty clinic, is it free to defend not only a same-sex couple that was wanting to buy a cake, but also free to defend the baker who didn't want to sell the cake?
Yeah.
A very interesting legal ethics question is whether universities and their clinics can be adverse to each other in the same proceeding.
Interesting.
Be adverse to each other in the same proceeding. Why don't we at this point open the floor for questions from the audience? I'm sure that you have many. Please approach the microphones. I believe that they are operational. Yes.
So I have a question, but first, as a point of information, as the answer to the question, when I was a Harvard Law student, there was a landlord-tenant clinic that exclusively represented tenants. I wanted to represent small landlords, and I was treated as very odd and had to fight, but they let me many years ago. My question is this. There has been, in this entire discussion of the university as a singular, the university. And I wanted to raise several different types of questions about diversity between universities. First of all, the religious universities, where there is heresy and orthodoxy, and in some places to get tenure you need an imprimatur and a nihil obstat. If they are the only ones that can take positions, I, as a secular person who wants to take positions, worry. And so I have I'm reproducing what I said at Michael McConnell's conference about 5 or 6 years ago on freedom of speech in the university. Why don't we think more about diversity between universities so that there can be the taboo hypothesis for the university is far less of a demanding environment for students to choose where they want to go. It's 4 years out of their life, even faculty have more mobility, and if people can be expected to choose a place of residence based on its attitudes and its services, why isn't there more room for diversity among universities, including on the question of what kinds of speech and what kinds of positions are tolerated? That said, I'm glad I'm at the University of Chicago. I chose it because I value the Calvin principles, but I can easily imagine other well-developed ecosystems for universities. Why don't we have that? And yeah.
Thoughts? Well, internationally speaking, the U.S. higher education is notable for the fact that we have a market in different forms of higher education, different colleges. Some are secular, some are parochial, some are state, some are private, mostly private. So we do actually celebrate that in the United States. And it would have implications for what the theme of the panel was, which is what's the mission. Now, one of the things you cannot do and be a university, which is to say, as a university, that means you're dedicated to truth. You can't know in advance what the truth is. So the idea of, if you are an institution of higher education and you already know the truth, many theological seminaries are like this, then you will be regarded by the AAUP as the language that they used in 1915 was flying under a false flag. You pretend to be a university, but really you are indoctrinating people, not educating them. That would be the theory of the thing. So you can have different missions, but the mission must be, if you're going to be understood to be a university, aimed at truth, which requires a certain degree of academic freedom for the reasons that the panel members have said.
I lecture a lot at religious universities. I'm myself a Catholic, and I get invited to Yeshiva and Brigham Young and Baylor and Zaytuna, the Muslim Liberal Arts College in Berkeley, and Notre Dame, and all sorts of other places. I'm considered a friend. I'm welcome. But my message to them every single time is, yes, the norms of academic freedom, and certainly the norms of institutional neutrality that apply in faith-based universities with their dual mandate will be different to some extent than those that apply at non-sectarian institutions. This is the point I made at the very beginning and said I would talk about if somebody asked and you made the mistake of asking. But I say to every single one of them, not all that different. If you're indoctrinating, then it's not education. If you, let me go to Notre Dame, for example, which is a great university, a true university, and it's got a wonderful tradition of philosophy there. If students majoring in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame have not read and seriously engaged and seriously considered and felt the force of Nietzsche's arguments against Christianity and against religion, you haven't educated them. You have failed. That's a disgrace. So you've got to make sure that you're exposing students to the best that has been taught and said. Now, there are lots of things you can do. For example, I don't object in principle if a place like Brigham Young University says, look, this is a university where to be a member of the faculty, you have to belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I say, fine, okay, you've got a mission here. It's a dual mission. It's truth-seeking, but you're also, of course, promoting your faith. But even there, if your students are not confronted with serious arguments against Mormon doctrine, not educating them.
There's a famous argument by Paul Carrington against critical legal studies, who said lawyers in law schools have to be indoctrinated into the importance of the rule of law. We're like theological seminaries. So he was saying anyone in critical legal studies shouldn't be tenured in a law school for this reason, exactly.
Yes.
So I think one thing that's missing from the discussion that's triggered by the conversation you were just having about clinics is the role of institutional neutrality in making curricular decisions. And there are very few schools that just say to professors, teach whatever courses you want, right? They at least the title is typically given to us, even if we have some academic freedom within that. And so I was wondering if you can, various views, share your views on sort of what does institutional neutrality look like when the university is choosing, yes, offer this course, don't offer this course. And in certain departments especially, that can be a highly content-specific and controversial choice.
Well, I mean, the typical way, and we have David Raban in the audience, who's like the world's expert on this very problem, but the typical answer would be, so long as those judgments are made by peer faculty, as opposed to administrators who are imposing it on faculty. It's consistent with academic freedom because every department has to make its own judgments about what courses to teach, who to hire, etc. If this is done at the faculty level by those competent to make those judgments, presumably that's the theory of academic freedom, then it's okay. But if an administrator is saying, I don't want to teach that because it's going to displease the donors, then you have a serious problem.
Just a very quick comment. I think at many universities today you have a problem, a skewing of the course offerings that reflects the underlying problem of the lack of viewpoint diversity. So certain subject matters that really should be covered in like a great university should have a course in the history department on the American Civil War, should have a course on the Revolutionary period, whatever. Sometimes those courses aren't being taught, and if you look at what's going on back there, the lack of viewpoint diversity means that there aren't people interested in those topics. So it's a problem. If we could solve the viewpoint diversity problem, a lot of what we're worried about in universities today would not be a problem.
I'll just say, as someone that did my first degree in another country, one of the things that's remarkable about American legal education is the amount of discretion that professors get in not only what courses they get to teach. I get told I have to teach a seminar, and no one gives me much instruction beyond that, but also the content of those courses. This quarter I'm teaching constitutional law, and I think I'm like roughly aware that I'm not allowed to do the rights and I have to do the structure, but like beyond that, I seem to have a remarkable degree of discretion about what makes that up. This might be an instance where, I mean, obviously, if there was a suggestion that there was, restrictions placed on what people could do based on viewpoint discrimination, that would be extremely worrying. But this might be an instance where institutional neutrality is not serving a broader goal of viewpoint diversity at the university, where if faculty are having lots and lots of discretion in what they teach, and then Robbie's suggesting that there are all sorts of holes in the course catalog that could be filled by the university going out and finding other professors, other instructors to fill those slots, then maybe that would be a better solution than the university just washing its hands of the problem.
First faculty meeting I ever attended when I went to Yale, Guido Calabresi stood up and he said, the glory of this place is that we have two professors teaching torts and they will not read a single case in common. Yeah. I thought, I am not in Kansas anymore.
One small but important point unique to the clinics is that unlike other classes, they're very expensive. And so the question of who's going, if any one of us, if Evelyn says, oh, I want to teach a seminar on X next year, they can just sit and write the syllabus, and all it costs is a pen and a paper, and then the students show up, and the students buy the books. There's no cost to you other than sitting with your word processor and your thoughts. Building a clinic, I can tell you from experience, is expensive, which means then, as a result, actually, the faculty doesn't have purse strings. So the questions of what you're going to build are at this messy middle spot, actually, of it's a resource deployment question in addition to a curricular design question. And faculty, among all the things that they have, and faculty governance varies by schools, but they rarely can just vote to redirect $1 million from here to over there, which makes it a challenge.
Which means that someone high up is making
Yes.
a decision on which clinics, which leads to what cases originate.
Correct.
Yes.
As the panelists raised multiple times, universities...
Talk into the mic.
As the panelists raised multiple times, universities are not just engaged in the core mission of generating and transmitting truth, they are embedded economic actors that have to make decisions about catering or health or provision of dormitories that require them to make decisions that put pressure on a commitment to institutional neutrality. I wanted to ask whether we could just pull the contrapositive, the Stephen move on that and say, well, is that not an argument in favor of slimming down the economic footprint that universities have? With some not very creative organizational restructuring, you could have universities get out of the catering and the dormitory business by chartering out or contracting out those services to third parties, providing some insulation between whatever message those third-party contractors are sending and the university would be sending if they had engaged in those actions on their own. So maybe going with Stephen's example about providing meat, you don't have to have a university catering service. You can have a third-party caterers are us hired by the university to provide food for the students. Is that a solution, or is it another one of the loopholes that you could drive a truck through?
I think my own view is it's sort of neither. It doesn't strike me as quite a loophole, but also not a solution in that, gosh, in the 10 years I've been at Harvard, I think we've gone back and forth between whether Sodexo whether we've outsourced the cafeteria or not. And I don't think it actually does one whit of a difference to the meat question. You're either directly have employees who are cooking meat, or you have decided to hire a company that you know will cook meat and will do it on the building that you own. So I think it moves where the decision is, but this is why I say that I think the investment portfolios are such a challenge. There is action occurring that is normatively inflected on salient and controversial questions. And whether the action is Harvard employee serves meat or Harvard contractee serves meat, I don't think gets you out of it. I think in the same way that, look, divestiture is one of the hot button things, and there the causal chains are actually more attenuated, right? The claim is never the president just signed a check to buy a bomb and drop it somewhere, right? The claim is it's attenuated in certain ways in the same way that the contracting is attenuated, and yet still clearly the force of the claim that this is action that you ought not take is going to be made no matter what. I think it's just inescapable that the universities cannot be simple actors, even if they can outsource things. That itself is an action that is controversial potentially.
Evelyn, may I ask, in the country where you received your undergraduate education, I'm guessing what country that is, but is it the case that universities do not provide the kind of student life, generic student life that we have here in the United States, that there's a private market for housing, there's a private market for food, healthcare is not on the university. That would, if we had a system like that, it would disentangle us.
Yeah, so I mean, completely. So I don't know if this was your guess, but it was Australia. Surprise, g'day. And I mean, I think it goes back to this, these questions can't be divorced from the political context, the political and economic context. I mean, the universities in Australia just live in a completely different context. They are largely public funded and significantly so. Very few students live on campus because universities are in the capital cities, which means that most students don't leave home. When they go to university. I lived at home all the way through my undergraduate degree and was not like particularly clingy in doing so. That was very normal, and so you don't have the student life. And then I think also just the broader political context. I mean, part of the underlying current here is so many things have been politicized in a way that makes everything, suddenly all of these little choices have political valence and political salience in ways that I mean, I haven't been in Australia now, I haven't lived there for a decade, but weren't true at least when I was there.
I think part of the construction of certain choices as political also depends on them being matters of controversy. So, if Harvard divested from junk bonds, nobody would see that as a big deal because it's not sending a message about this is how you ought to think about junk bonds. But if they divest from Israel, that is sending a message, and it's done to send a message. And so I think it's very hard there the action and message sending component of said action are very closely related to one another, whereas in other contexts it might not be. Yes?
Yes, this is not a new issue. I have a chapter on it in a book published a little over 50 years ago, after I spent 4 or 5 years at University of Chicago overlapping the Calvin report. I'm an economist. I think in terms of trade-offs. And I think the right way to think about it is that for a university to take a position on anything at all undercuts its mission in terms of education, but unfortunately you can't avoid doing it. And that therefore you want to take positions only where it's unavoidable, which includes whether you have meat in the cafeteria, and it also includes who you hire and what courses you have. But because it is very costly, you don't want to do it in the form of making statements about the university says that the country should do X or Y. In the case of investments, speaking as an economist, whether the University of Chicago invests in South Africa has essentially no effect on South Africa, economically speaking, because there are lots of other people who can invest in South Africa. The reason SDS was pushing that was to get the university to make a statement that it was against South Africa. And you can't prevent them from doing it because it is or isn't investing it. It's the decision they have to make. But I would have said that the right policy for everybody who can is to downplay that as much as possible, to get as little attention to it as possible, but nonetheless, it's an honest argument you can't do anything about. I would say that I strongly disagree with Professor Crespo about his support for enforced orthodoxy. I don't think there should be any positions at all where the official position of the university is X is true, and we will proclaim to the university that X is true. Because in the real world, you will observe that there are often departments which are 98% of some political or ideological view. And once you take the position, it is legitimate to say, discussion is finished on this issue, they are going to use it. So I think the right policy is to say that there are no orthodoxies. Yes, the university has to make some decisions. Unfortunately, it's making the decisions has a bad effect because it means that if you are against meat, you have an incentive to try to get vegetarians hired so that there'll be more votes for banning meat from the cafeteria. That's a bad thing, but you can't do anything about it. But you can avoid any place where it's unnecessary to raise those issues. So that would be my view, at least.
So I was going to try to jump in when there was crosstalk before with Professor George, because I think, agree with you and want to make sure I'm clear in what I'm saying about my point about heresy. Because I actually agree. I don't think that a university ought to enforce even the outer boundaries of what I'm calling, when you said 2 plus 2, the 2 plus 2 plus 5 point, I actually had exactly the same thought when Professor Post said it. I think that, a university, if it has a tenured professor who's saying 2 plus 2 equals 5, there shouldn't be any sort of enforcement about that. And in fact, it should be, I think, as you say, inviting that person to say, please say more. I want to hear more about this, because that sounds to me initially kind of crazy, but you are the expert, let's hear, right? The point I was trying to make was a sociological point, which is that I think it is just definitional about a society that they have at least some things that they have some sort of shared agreements about. And that's true about various sub-communities that are trying to have an exchange with each other. And that is what makes it hard, given what you're saying, that the university can't avoid action, that it has to act within that setting, which means that it's going to constantly run into these boundaries of what are our sort of given absolutes upon which we take action? What are the basic sets of institutional values upon which we then move and act in the world? Including who we hire, including where we put money. Like, there are hard questions that relate to the educational mission in which it has to take action. But I agree completely in the almost ideal type version of the university as forum for debate, that once the people who you've decided are your institutional citizens are having debates about controversial stuff, there's no role for the university to say that particular speech act, that idea, is one you're not allowed to say or engage in. The hard part for me is they have to take action where they don't have that liberty, exactly as you say, and that they're doing it against a backdrop in which a society does have identifiable heresies. The university can't enforce them, but it has to move through a world where there exists some edge of shared knowledge.
I should say, by the way, that of course you are correct that the university should not penalize professors who happen to have other positions for taking positions. That's what they're supposed to be doing. It's the university as a corporate body that should take as few positions as it can get away with, essentially.
I think we professors would do very well to become better at modeling, especially for our students and for graduate students and for young professors, the virtue of intellectual humility. It is so critical to the pursuit of truth. And yet, I think as a class, we're not very good at it, and I'll declare myself as guilty as anyone else on this. I think perhaps the way to remind ourselves about the need for that intellectual humility, if we are to be determined truth seekers, is just to think of all the instances throughout history in which the consensus has been wrong. And then just ask ourselves, okay, what are the let's look at today's consensuses. Which ones of those will turn out to be wrong?
Just as a counter-example, first of all, I want to say about the 2 plus 2 equals 5. Are you going to hire that person? That's the first question. And we're not talking about tenure. Second, we all have had colleagues who are reaching my age and are kind of senile and they're incompetent and they can't really talk to the point. How do you know that? It's because they're telling their class 2 + 2 = 5. I was chair of the Academic Freedom Committee of the UC Berkeley, and I had someone come to me with a complaint. And the complaint was, my work is revolutionary, it's paradigm shifting in the field of, this was architecture, and my academic freedom is being denied. Why? Because the department won't let students major in me. Me, because my work is so paradigm shifting. Now, how am I supposed to, as an academic freedom person, is your academic...
Wait, that's intellectual humility.
I have to say, are you that great? Are you not? Who's going to make that decision?
I believe we have time for one last question.
Oh, well, I feel bad, but not that bad. So look, I've only been in academia 2 years, so maybe I'm naive, but I just think there's a disconnect with reality. We have all these platitudes about preserving diversity of opinion and protecting people. But if that's true and it's really happening, why are universities still seen as bastions of liberalism? And they are that way, seen by the American public. Robert, you talked about indoctrination. A lot of people see universities as indoctrinating our kids in anti-capitalism and anti-business. Now, I know they graduate and learn better. But the point is there's really not this kind of diversity. I can tell you, it ain't there at Cornell. As a Republican, I feel ostracized. And I know there's Liberty University and stuff like this, but this is a problem with universities and how they're perceived in this country. And all this talk about diversity, I just don't see it. I don't see it happening. I just see, and maybe it's because conservatives don't like to be in academia because they don't make enough money or something, but there's something else going on. But I don't see the talk living up to the reality, at least in major universities across the country.
Well, first thing I'd say to that is, as someone who's himself a conservative, I'd like to have the old liberals back. Those were the days. When I began back in the Middle Ages, arrived in Princeton in the fall of 1985, the old school liberals who really did believe in, free speech and viewpoint diversity, I couldn't have been higher because I was out of the closet. I mean, I did not hide my views about things, even on controversial issues. The only reason I got hired is because there were old school liberals who were the dominant force on the campus. And I just assumed naively that that would be the case forever. That's just the way it is, not just at Princeton, but at Harvard and Ohio State and Temple and every place else. The thing that I find most surprising now as I enter my 40th year in academia is that old school liberalism, which was so overwhelming when I began, is now pretty much gone. There are more conservatives now, certainly at Princeton, than when I began. That's certainly true. When I began, I was sort of the only out of the closet one. Now there are a couple of dozen at least, very publicly conservative professors. But what has really diminished are old school liberals.
See, I think you're speaking from a certain paradigm of what the university is. There isn't an economics department in the country that I know where people are being indoctrinated against capitalism. Not one. So when you say what you just said, I'm guessing you're generalizing from English departments or maybe history departments, less so. So there are certain people in the humanities, or certain departments in the humanities, where what you're saying may be true. It's certainly not true in the sciences. It's certainly not true in the biological sciences. It's not true in many social science departments. I don't think it's true of most government or political science departments. It may be true in certain humanities departments. And you're metonymically substituting the university for those departments. That's a mistake. If you look at the university as a whole, it does not have the properties that you're describing.
There's a good deal of data on party affiliation and ideological
But here we're talking about what people are being educated to do.
No, that's true. But if you do look, I mean, economics has the closest number of Democrats, for example, Republicans to Democrats. But it's sort of 6 Democrats to 1 Republican, as opposed to sociology, where it's 40 to 1, or anthropology.
Do you know people in the economics department who are teaching kids to overturn capitalism?
I
Of course
agree
not.
with that.
You could look at what you're...
There is a viewpoint imbalance, but it's not that they're Marxists in economics. If you want to find a Marxist, you got to go to some other
Northeastern.
department. Yeah. Well, no, you can find them in a university. I mean, you can find them at Harvard, you can find them at Princeton, but not in the economics department.
I think you could look at what you're educating them to do, and you could also look at what they are doing. I mean, you know, the vast majority of our students are going to go work at large law firms that are not anti-capitalist institutions. So I don't think, and we are preparing them to do that work. So I think, again, it goes a bit to Robert's point, that I tend to agree, but also it's just not what we're educating to do, it's what is the actual role. We're, I think, very actively building the continuation of a profession that is, of all the things you could describe it, I don't think trying to tear down American capitalism.
One might cynically describe the push for institutional statements as in some ways an attempted expiation of the sin of preparing people to enter the capitalist economy. But with that, thank you all very much for spending your afternoon with us, and thank you all to the members of the panel.
You've been at Harvard 10 years, Andy?